I'm going to highlight Kili first because Kili, the summit experience on that is different because it's the highest freestanding mountain in the world. Kilimanjaro is not a part of a mountain range. So when you're on top of Kili, your 360-degree view, you're looking out over Africa. You're not one mountain among many mountains. So that makes that summit much more unique. When you're in Colorado on the 14ers, specifically, you're in the Rockies, right? And potentially you're not on the highest 14er in your immediate area. You're up there and you are on the peak and you're seeing all the other peaks. They're equal to you or you're looking down. So it's a pretty cool feeling. With Everest Base Camp and that trek, I think I mentioned earlier, we're hiking up a valley. And as you work your way toward base camp, the mountains start to get bigger. So to give you an idea of scale, Marcus, which is one of the things that blew my mind about Everest Base Camp is, the highest points in the lower 48 are 14,000 some odd feet, right? When you're working your way up the Khumbu Valley, there's a point there where we're at 14,000 feet. So we're basically on top of the Rockies at the same altitude, per se, and you're looking up at peaks that are 20 and 25,000 plus feet. So the scale is just otherworldly.
Folks, we got Will Burkhart on the podcast. He's the founder of Badass Adventures. He was my first guest on the Hike Strong podcast, which was all about rim-to-rim hiking. And I've heard that from rim-to-rim folks that episode is a must listen for anyone attempting a one-day rim-to-rim hike. Will, have you heard that, my friend?
All my clients have found it to be very helpful. I include it in my welcome package, prep package for them. And I just really get a good feel for it, gets them motivated, and real clear about what they're getting into.
All right, we agree. All right, so moving on to the topic of today, and that is non-technical high-altitude mountaineering. So this episode was actually Will's idea, and so I obliged. So by non-technical, we mean no use of ropes or belaying, and then to kind of define the parameters of high-altitude hiking, we're going to define that today as a range from like 14,000 to 19,400. So to give you some perspective of the height that we're talking about today, the south rim of the Grand Canyon, 7,000 feet, north rim's 8,000 feet. The highest peak in the lower 48 on the East Coast is Mount Mitchell. That's in North Carolina. That's 6,684 feet. Mount Washington in New Hampshire, 6,288 feet. Now, the tallest mountain in the contiguous lower 48 states is on the West Coast. That's Mount Whitney. That's 14,505. That's in California. And then the next three are all located in Colorado. And then there's Mount Rainier in Washington, which takes fifth place at 14,410. But it's a technical climb, so we're not really talking about that today. So the most technical of what we're talking about might require some handholds and footholds for upward or downward progress, but that's not the majority of the climbs. So for the destinations that we discussed today, all you need to do is get in shape and freaking go. But if you want to learn more about technical mountain climbing and how to get started, you can check out episode 5 of the Hike Strong podcast. So anyway, Will and I were talking a couple weeks ago, and he says to me that if someone wants to get into non-technical, high-altitude mountaineering in a very civilized way and wants to see how their body responds to and see how much they like it, that he has a plan for that. So the way that we'll approach understanding his plan today is by explaining a tiered approach, starting with climbing 14ers, then experiencing Everest Base Camp, and then Mount Kilimanjaro. To provide an interesting perspective to these three pursuits, he'll compare and contrast each one of them. And so I think it's a great idea, but Will, tell me kind of what inspired you to think about packaging it up in this way.
Marcus, I think it's for people who are unfamiliar with it, right? But for people who really want to, get on mountains and climb them, it's like, okay, how do we start? What are the moving pieces that will ideally provide them with the greatest opportunity for success? So this is why I came up with this, because a lot of people, they're like, oh, I want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. It's on my bucket list, or Everest Base Camp. I've always wanted to hike through the Khumbu in Nepal, but maybe it's way out of their wheelhouse. So the main idea is, give people some of the fundamentals, as far as preparation, what the elements are in the preparation and in these hikes, to take the unknown out of it so they can gain confidence. and ideally, make those dreams come true.
Okay, cool. All right, so I want to give one last little bit of perspective, and then we'll get into it. To summit any of the Colorado 14ers, and I guess that's what we use as our reference when talking about 14ers, or those 58 in Colorado. The trailheads generally start at an elevation between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, depending on the mountain and the route. Everest Base Camp is at 17,598 feet. We'll talk about going higher, but we'll get to that. So anyway, that hike starts from Lukla at 9,383 feet. And then Kili's summit is at 19,431. And the elevation that you start at depends on the route that you'll be taking. So it could be anywhere from 6,000, 7,000, or maybe even starting from a little over 11,000 feet. Anyway, that's some more perspective. Let's kind of get into it. Any more thoughts on what I've said above, Will, or are we just going to jump right in?
No, it sounds great, Marcus. You set it up really nicely.
Okay. So after each question that I ask you, you'll contrast the differences or the similarities between the 14ers, Everest Base Camp, and Kili. And that's not to say that anyone is better than the other. They're all, very different. So let's rock and roll, man. So number one, describe the trail conditions on each of those.
So as far as 14ers go, Marcus, you're going to have the most variety of trails depending on the mountain you're on. Generally it's the Rocky Mountains, and they're named the Rocky Mountains for a reason. You're going to encounter a lot of rock on the trail. A lot of the trails on those mountains are going to be single track. Sometimes the approach might be a gravel road, kind of an access road, but you'll be on single track. And then as you weave your way more to the top, the trail can get a little bit less distinct because the amount of rock just picks up. That's what you're looking at there. The one thing about Colorado 14ers is generally the steepest part of the trail is near the summit. So, usually they'll approach more gently, and then as you start to reach that last 1,000 feet or so, 800 to 1,000 feet of climb, it starts to get a little more vertical generally. As far as Kili goes, Kilimanjaro, you're going through like 5 climate zones. Because of that, the trail conditions vary. We basically start out in a rainforest type of environment where it's double wide, double track dirt with roots, and there's monkeys in the trees, and it's pretty fascinating. And then as you move up, it starts to get colder and drier. You get into some moorland grasslands where the trail, you start to encounter more rock, less foliage. And then as you go through kind of a volcanic zone that's a little more rocky. And eventually you end up on summit day where you're going pretty straight up and it's on loose packed rock. And then by the time you're at the summit, as you're hiking to the summit, you'll see a glacier on your left side. So you'll be up there. You won't be on the glacier, but that's what we're looking at there. And then Everest Base Camp, that trek goes through 2 climate zones. Again, you're starting in kind of a tropical area where there's a lot more rain and foliage. And it's in a valley the whole time, the Khumbu Valley. So it's a little bit of a different animal versus you're just going straight up a mountain. So you're going up through the valleys, you're starting around 9,000 feet, you end up at just over 17,000 feet. The one thing about that trail, I say trail in parentheses, is it's the main route, like literally the road, the highway, that all the villages in that valley use to go back and forth for their own transportation. So you'll run into yaks on that, horses, the natives just doing their thing. So it's a very different feel. You go across suspension bridges. So it's much more interactive culturally. And so the trail, again, is less like a trail and more like it's definitely a trail, but it's more than just hikers on it, more than just mountaineers. And similarly to the other trail conditions, as you go up, it gets colder, gets rockier, vegetation gets less, more sparse, and the trail gets less used. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Again, none of these hikes necessarily, you're not going to need crampons if you're doing it in non-winter months. So you don't need spikes, no ice axes, there's no crevasses, you're not on glaciers, so no need to rope up, any of that stuff, all non-technical. I do, for as far as footwear, just to segue into footwear a little bit, I'm in low-cut hiking shoes for the majority of these hikes. Maybe on summit day, I'll put on an insulated pair of boots. But that's what we're looking at as far as trail and what you're going to wear on your feet.
Okay. All right. So let's compare and contrast miles hiking per day.
So yeah, the mileage, Again, the 14er you choose is going to, the mileage will vary. But, you already gave them a range of how much elevation you'll gain. And really, that's the number one component that we're looking at with high altitude mountaineering is controlling how much elevation gain we have on any given day on the climb that we're doing. As far as mileage goes, for a 14er, it could be anywhere from a 5 to 10 mile hike round trip. When we're talking about Kilimanjaro, we're looking at 37 to 42 miles round trip, depending on the route we take. The two routes that I use, 37 to 42 miles. And you can kind of do the math. We're on the trail on Kili for 7 days or 8 days. That's the time frame I use. So we're taking littler chunks of that 37 to 42 miles going up, and we basically come down the mountain in 2 days. But we're going downhill. We've got gravity, so it's a lot easier. So on average, on Kili, we're going to be going right around 6 to 8 miles a day over the course of the day. So that's distance-wise. And then Everest Base Camp is 80 miles round trip, and we generally allow 10 days for that, so 8 miles a day. Again, it's going to be a bit shorter on the front end because, we basically take our time going out. We have, acclimatization days in there. On the way back, going downhill again, losing altitude, you'll gain more miles. I think the most mileage we have in any given day on that is maybe 12, give or take. So,
okay. Let's talk about landscape and foliage changes as you approach the summits.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about Kili. Again, they've got the 5 climate zones. And whenever it comes to foliage and what you're looking at, it's all based on how much precipitation an area gets, how cold it gets. So again, we're in the rainforest zone on Kili. That's generally where we start. We move through what they call the Afro-Alpine moorland zone, which goes from rainforest to more shrubs and grasses. Then as we get higher, above 4,000 meters, we're at the Alpine Desert Zone, which is really rocky and volcanic rock. And then on summit day, you're in the Arctic Zone. So that's generally above 5,000 meters. And it's all going to be ice and rock and snow when snow is present. The thing I love about that, Marcus, is it's almost like, especially on Kilimanjaro, it's like every day it's almost like climbing a different mountain. Because what you're climbing through is just the scenery and the shrubbery, all that is just so different. With Everest Base Camp, what you've got is there's just 2 climate zones on that hike. And it's a temperate highland tropical zone and then an alpine tundra zone. Again, the highland subtropical zone, it is heavily foliaged, so it's kind of cool. That's usually for the first couple of days. And then we're more in the alpine tundra where it's just some tough grasses and rocks and snow and whatnot. And there's no quote unquote summit day to Everest Base Camp. We do go into the base camp, which is just all rock, snow. I'll throw this in now. Typically the highlight of the Everest Base Camp trip, once after you get to base camp, is the next morning we'll climb an adjacent mountain called Kalapatar, and that's just over 18,000 feet. And Kalapatar gives us a perfect vantage point to watch the sunrise over Everest. So generally one of the most magical, memorable sunrises of your life to see the sun come up over the highest mountain on the planet.
Let's have you describe the summit day for all 3. You can also weave in kind of the physical and mental aspects of the 3 different summit days. And again, you didn't describe Everest Base Camp as necessarily a summit, but kind of that end point. So anyway, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, we'll just start with Everest Base Camp. Again, you're hiking through the Khumbu, very cultural experience and interactive, big Buddhist influence in that one. And then again, as we get closer to base camp, the people get thinner, there's less people on the trail. And eventually, it's all climbers that are going there or trekkers. On that particular trip, you're going tea house to tea house. So you basically, we wake up in the morning and by afternoon, we're at base camp and we hang out for a couple of hours, take photos, check it out and talk to anybody who's there, come back. Then the next morning is when we do Kalapatar. That's really just a hike up the mountain. It's non-technical, pretty straightforward. And that's magical because, again, that sunrise, right? It's cold. That's definitely the coldest day of the hike because we're up before sunrise. But if the conditions are ideal, then it's a magical morning. The nice thing about Everest and the nice thing about Kili is, it's a multi-day hike. You can see the progress you're making. You can feel it as you gain elevation. Your body feels it. The anticipation builds, the excitement builds. So, once you get to the quote summit or the destination, it's like, wow, this is a magical time. Contrast that to climbing Colorado 14ers. Generally, that's a one-day deal. You're up at sunrise or shortly thereafter. It's a day hike. So, yeah, it's just your climbing day. There's some times, depending on the mountain, you can take multiple days to do it. I prefer generally, just knocking it out in a single day. Acclimatize my clients beforehand so that come summit day, they're ready. They're already acclimated and it's just up and down. And then Kili, the interesting thing about Kili is the success rate on Kili is only 60%. And the reason for that is most people don't take enough days to acclimate. So ideally, my trips are 7 or 8 days. So on that summit day, we're up usually at midnight, give or take, and we're hiking up in the dark for the majority of that hike. So it's cold, it's dark, you got your headlamps on, and you're literally just following the feet in front of you, the cone of your light, moving pretty slow. Because again, at that point, summit day, I think we gain a little over 2,000 feet of elevation. So we were at 17 and change, we get up to 19 and change. But at some point, the sun rises and it starts to heat up. And the other interesting thing about Kili is there's a summit before the summit. So the steep part, you go up and then you get up onto the ridge. There's a summit sign there for people who don't want to take the extra half hour to 40 minutes to hike along the ridge and gain the proper summit for Kili. So depending on how people are feeling and what's going on, they'll either stop there or they'll continue along on the ridge. Kili is the most crowded of all of these endeavors, okay? So depending on the time of year you go on Kili, there can be a lot of people up there. But again, everybody's usually in good spirits. They're pretty tired because it's been a big day. You're up at midnight, but you're relieved. You're at the top. They have a big sign. You take all the photos, and then it's just a matter of getting down and back to high camp and then working our way down the mountain.
Going back to the 14ers, explain why it's important to get up early and get off the mountain by noon.
Yeah, so generally, especially summertime, and we're talking summer conditions is, generally for a novice mountaineer, high altitude mountaineer, you're not necessarily going to want to be hiking in a lot of snow and ice. So in the summer in Colorado, they'll get afternoon storms roll in. You want to be off those mountains by the time the storms roll in because oftentimes they're accompanied by lightning. You never want to be on the highest point around when lightning is around. So yeah, the idea is to get up early, be up and off the summit by noon. On that particular climb, because of that, I will have what's called a turnaround time. So if we haven't made the summit by a certain time, we turn around. And that's mostly based on weather conditions and watching if weather's rolling in. So that's the reason for that.
What time do you wake up? Generally, what time do you arrive at the summit? And again, mention that for both Everest Base Camp and Kili.
Yeah, so Everest Base Camp, that's an 8 a.m. rise. We have breakfast, and then we spend the day hiking. And we're usually at base camp midday, just after lunch. And we spend a few hours, and then we're back. And that's kind of how all the days look on that trek. Then the next day, when we summit Kalapatar for the sunrise, we get up, hour and a half or so before sunrise and make that trek up so that we can capture sunrise as it's coming up over Everest. Kilimanjaro, I've done it 2 ways. I've done the midnight wake up, where you wake up at midnight, sunrise happens somewhere along the way on your way up. Obviously, you're on the summit very early in the day and then back down. I've also done it where we leave closer to 4 in the morning, and so it's a little bit later of a start. The nice thing about that is you're not in the dark and it's not quite as cold for as long. So and then you summit and then you come back. Typically on Kilimanjaro, you're coming back to high camp. You're having lunch and then you're hiking down an additional few thousand feet to sleep for the night. And with Everest Base Camp, the deal with that is we're in tea houses every night. So it's relatively speaking more comfortable. And then I think I said, with the 14ers, it's usually a dawn start or pre-dawn start and off the mountain by noon.
Okay. And then talk about different vantage points when you take a 360-degree view, particularly in the valley of Everest, when you're doing Everest Base Camp, And maybe just on the summits of Kili and Colorado 14ers.
Yeah, so the unique thing, I'm going to highlight Kili first because Kili, the summit experience on that's different because it's the highest freestanding mountain in the world. Okay. Kilimanjaro is not a part of a mountain range. So when you're on top of Kili, you're basically, your 360-degree view, you're looking out over Africa. You're not one mountain among many mountains. So that makes that summit much more unique. Whereas when you're in Colorado on the 14ers, when specifically, you're in the Rockies, right? And you could, potentially you're not on the highest 14er in your immediate area, but you're up there and you are on the peak and you're seeing all the other peaks. You're basically either they're equal to you or you're looking down. So it's a pretty cool feeling. And with Everest Base Camp and that trek, I think I mentioned earlier, we're hiking up a valley. And as you work your way toward base camp, the mountains start to get bigger. So to give you an idea of scale, Marcus, which is one of the things that blew my mind about Everest Base Camp is, the highest points in the lower 48 are 14,000 some odd feet, right? When you're working your way up the Khumbu Valley, there's a point there where we're at 14,000 feet. So we're basically on top of the Rockies at the same altitude per se, and you're looking up at peaks that are 20 and 25,000 plus feet. So the scale is just otherworldly. And you're hiking up this valley and you see these magnificent peaks. There's one point on the trek where we come up out of a valley up and over a ridge, so to speak. And that's the first time you can see Everest and all the big mountains. So if it's a clear day, you're up there, there's a monastery up there, a really beautiful monastery. And you can just see the Himalaya laid out like it's almost surreal. And that's what you're hiking through every day. Ironically, at Everest Base Camp, you can't see the summit. You can't see the mountain because you're so close up against it. You can see the Khumbu icefall and some of the things we've heard about on the climbing route, which is why, again, we go to Kilimanjaro the next day so we get the full view of the mountain and, in all of its glory at sunrise. So they're very different experiences on quote unquote summit day, which, adds to I think it just adds to the magnificence of the experience of, high altitude mountaineering and the diversity you can get.
All right. So I do want to get back to acclimatization, but let's do a couple other questions here. Let's go with kind of cultural immersion. Colorado, I don't know. You tell me, what's the cultural immersion there? You might have something for that. But I know there's a distinct difference between Everest Base Camp climb and Kili.
Yeah. Yeah, like Colorado, that was originally mining country, right? Mining and ranching and all that. Yeah, so it's a different deal. Ironically, with Colorado, I think Colorado has become overloved. The 14ers are getting much more crowded. I first was in Colorado back in 1996, or no, actually, 96. And it was a lot different back then because it just wasn't, mountaineering wasn't as popular. Nowadays in Colorado, on any given weekend, the 14ers are pretty busy with, weekend mountaineers. Everybody loves it. So, and it's understandable. And you'll meet people from all over the U.S. and all over the world in Colorado, which is kind of cool. And everybody's always really friendly and whatnot, but it's obviously its thing. Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, the Tanzania is one of the most stable governments and stable countries in Africa. And the main reason is they know that tourism is their bread and butter. Like that is the backbone of their economy, whether it's safaris, Kili. So they have a very sophisticated tourist industry. They have that mountain you can get internet coverage on that mountain nowadays. They have it set up, to where, all the Tanzanian people are great. They're super friendly. They cater to the tourists, always smiling. So I really love the people of that country and just how they are. They also take their conservation very seriously as far as their wildlife and the mountain. The mountain's very clean. So love that cultural experience. If you've never been to Africa, that's like a great entry point onto that continent. And then with Nepal, completely different culture. It's a big Buddhist influence in Nepal. And as you're hiking up the valley, there'll be these small stupas along the way. And the stupas are Buddhists use is in a lot of their prayer and ceremonies, and they'll do circles around the stupas and they'll pray, and they've got prayer wheels, and that's how they meditate. It's almost like a walking meditation, a walking prayer. And there's a proper way to you always go around the stupas in a clockwise direction. And like I was saying earlier, Marcus, that is like we are sleeping in villages every night, in tea houses, and so we're in and amongst the people pretty much the entire way. And, they're doing their trade, they're moving goods and services up and down that valley when we're sharing the trail with them. So, when a yak train comes by or you run into a yak train, they have the right of way, but it's really cool. And the Nepalese people, very friendly. The Sherpas over there are just top notch. They know that valley, they know that deal really well. They take their tourism very seriously as well. So yeah, just culturally, a lot of diversity. And a really big part of the trip. It's more than just climbing a mountain. It's more than just going to base camp. It's a fully immersive trip, which I think just adds that much more magic to it.
Okay, that's cool. Let's go into kind of sleeping and eating. Now, with the 14ers, I mean, you and I have done where we get like an Airbnb, we go hit the 14er, we come back. We've also camped like in the Chicago Basin. So talk about that, and then, and then segue into the other two.
Yeah. So you've experienced my 14ers trips, Marcus. Yeah. And there's the lodge-based trip where we're hot tubbing and relaxing every night, and we're going out and hiking during the day. Or there's the backpack inn on the Chicago Basin, where it's a 7-mile backpack trip. We set up kind of base camp per se in the Chicago Basin, and then we hike the 14ers, day hikes of the 14ers, but we're sleeping back at the same tents, sleeping bag, that sort of thing. But very much a backpacking camping type of an environment. Of course, a cool thing that you probably stands out in your memory on the Chicago Basin trip, Marcus, was the train ride in and out. That's kind of a unique element to that particular trip. So yeah, it's really kind of what you're up for. Do you want to be more laid back and comfortable, or do you want to have the backpacking experience? How I do my trips, next I'll go to Kili, because Kili's kind of the next most rugged. With Kilimanjaro, you get 3 hot meals a day. You'll have staff come every morning and ask you what hot beverage you want, and they'll deliver the hot beverage to your tent. So it's beverage service in your tent. You're sleeping in a 2-person tent that's really like a 6-person tent. So it's a really spacious tent, and they set those tents up for you every night before you get there. You roll out your sleeping bag, your sleeping pad, but you're eating 3 hot squares a day, which is nice, in a kitchen tent, in a mess tent. So that's, you got hot beverages and whatnot. So it's really nice. And then with Everest Base Camp, how that works is, for my trips, it's tea house to tea house. So these tea houses are quasi-hostel like. There's a big dining room, communal dining room, where you can, order your food. And then the room situation, usually you're 2 people to a room, and you got bed with a, thick foam mattress on it. I recommend people bring their sleeping bags to sleep in for warmth. And then there's either a bathroom in each room, or there's a bathroom a shared bathroom down the hall type of thing. So that's kind of how the sleeping, and same, you're eating hot meals every day on Everest Base Camp trip as well. And don't get me wrong, Marcus, there's some people on Everest Base Camp where they tent camp every night. Like, they backpack in with all their stuff. So there's other ways to do it, right? If you want to, schlep all your gear and make it a backpacking trip, you can do that to Everest Base Camp. I like it better the way I do the trip. So.
Okay. All right. Let's go into acclimatization. So, let's talk about strategies for each one. You can discuss pace, meds, sleeping at elevation. I think on Everest Base Camp, you spend 2 nights in one place.
So yeah, that's, the big variable with high altitude mountaineering, and the big concern people have, and it's right to have it, is how am I going to respond to the altitude? Because there's very little that's known about altitude sickness, like what causes it, what the triggers are, other than being at altitude. It doesn't seem to be age dependent. It doesn't even seem to be fitness dependent or even experience dependent. So it's a really kind of mysterious thing that can literally just kind of catch you by surprise, right? But we're trying to obviously avoid altitude sickness. By the way, that takes the form of either cerebral edema or pulmonary edema. So either water on the brain or water in the lungs. Both will kill you if not treated properly. So, that's the risk factor. And everybody's like, oh, how's my body going to respond at altitude? And you're not going to know until you do it. But because we don't want people to get severe altitude sickness, that's where the acclimatization comes in. So again, that's why with high altitude mountaineering, it's not so much about the distance we cover. It's about how much elevation we're gaining each day. How high are we getting each day? Are we, typically the mantra in high altitude mountaineering is climb high, sleep low. That helps with that acclimatization. So like, let's take a Colorado 14er, for instance. With a 14er, we acclimate in the days leading up to the hike, right? So you get into Denver or Durango and you're at 7,000 feet and you sleep overnight. That acclimates you. You hike in the Chicago Basin or wherever, do some day hikes for a day, work your way up to maybe 10,000 feet, come back, and then boom, then you hit 14. And, you've been on those trips, Marcus, and you felt like, the altitude you'll definitely feel it. It will slow you down. Your breath will shorten. You can get a headache. Hydration is critical. On my Kili trips and my Everest Base Camp trips, I do recommend people take Diamox, which helps with altitude sickness. And you start taking that like literally a day before you start your trip, so that it's in your system. By the time you're at altitude, it's fully in your system. And that does tend to help. So on both, on Kili, you're averaging right around 2,000, between 1,500, right around 1,500 feet a day of altitude gain, between 1,500 and 2,000 feet of gain every day. And we just work our way up. And again, that is to get your body used to it. And, you'll, whether it's on a 14er or on Kili or Everest Base Camp, you start to get up around 14,000 feet, 13,000 and up, you're going to start to slow down. So your pace drops off considerably. Your heart rate will elevate. Your respiration rate elevates. And the answer is slowing down. So that's why these things take longer than, normal, right? It's like, oh, why does it take that long? Well, it's to get the body ready. And I mentioned earlier on Kili, it only has a 60% success rate because a lot of people get tight on their budget and they try to do Kili in 5 days or 4 days. And not having those extra couple of days to acclimate, it really bites people in the backside. So got to take it seriously. And again, I don't want to scare anybody, right? Because who knows if you're going to get hit with it. Because of how I do my trips, we basically have a 100% success rate because we take acclimatization so seriously. We don't do shortcuts. And on the off chance that someone does experience altitude sickness, we've got the medical training needed to take care of it. But, the answer for altitude sickness in treating it, the number one thing is you just get people to a lower altitude. It subsides. So that's basically damn near 100% effective. It's like, okay, as soon as we see symptoms and people report symptoms, we turn them around and get them down the mountain as fast as we can. So there's that. Did that answer the question, Marcus?
It did. I do want to say that obviously being fit helps mitigate the issues and the stress. So when you show up and you're fit, that means, because the key thing is, of course, to keep your heart rate and your respirations down as you're climbing. So if you're more fit, you're much more efficient in breathing, creating energy for movement. And so, I don't want to skip over that. Yeah. And the thing is, the thing I think that gets people is if you're in great shape, and because of that, you think, okay, because I'm in great shape, I'm going to move real fast. That's what bites people in the ass. So even though you're in great shape, you can mitigate some acute issues that you might get if you didn't train. But as long as you go slow, that's when you've got the best chance. Anyway, you can talk to that if you want.
Yeah. And, fitness is always key. A, for enjoyment. B, you're going to be more efficient. You're going to be able to enjoy the trip and take it all in. And from a safety standpoint, to be as fit as you can be, especially if we run into problems and you need to be able to take care of yourself and maybe hike extra or whatnot. Yeah, it's critical. There's no point in carrying extra weight up the mountain either. So,
yeah. And I think just for contrast, talk about Aconcagua, just kind of acclimatization for that. Just, it kind of puts it in perspective. It's definitely, as you've said before when we've talked, it's not really technical, but you will carry things up. You'll come down and sleep. Just talk about that for contrast.
Yeah. So a lot of people, they think, oh, I've done Kili, I've done whatever, I'm going to do Aconcagua next, and it's going to be similar. And it's a completely different experience. I mean, Aconcagua is a mountaineering mountain. And what I mean by that is with Aconcagua, you're setting camps, you have carry days and move days. So you basically almost climb the mountain twice on Aconcagua because you're staging gear, you're coming, sleeping low, then moving camp and all that. And Aconcagua is just about 23,000 feet. So it's a big mountain and the conditions tend to be a lot harsher down there. The winds are pretty nasty. And even though it's not a quote technical mountain, toward the summit, the last summit push, clients will get short rope if they're struggling. My first climb up Aconcagua, on the way down, there was a dead body wrapped in a tarp from a client who'd fallen. So it's not something to be trifled with, but we're working again, that's 23,000 feet, that's higher altitude. And, the acclimatization is critical on that as well. So yeah, it's a whole different beast. It's not civilized. Okay. Like Kili's very civilized, Aconcagua, not so much.
Okay. All right. Let's segue into fitness a bit. For the new folks that are listening to this, I always like to mention the Fit for Trips Big Five. And so these are kind of the 5 pillars to training. So Will and I can kind of talk about it just a little bit, but real quick, the Fit for Trips Big Five. So we want to train. You want to walk inclines, walk stairs, walk lunges, walk far, and high intensity interval training. If you want to filter it pretty easily in your brain, you might think of doing inclines 1 time a week, stairs 1 time a week, strength training 1 time a week, walk far 1 time a week, and do HIIT training. It's not the perfect formula, but it gives you kind of a prism from which to kind of think about how you want to structure your training. But I take it a step further and we talk about distance and elevation gain goals per week. Let's kind of contrast the 14ers. So 14ers, you're going to, you might get, let's say, 3,500 to 6,000 feet, maybe. I'm just riffing right now for the different 14ers. And that's in one day. Now on Kili, at least on the route that you do, it's like 16 to 17,000 feet of elevation gain. Now that's over, multiple days.
7 days. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
7 days. Okay. And then Everest Base Camp, you take how many days to get a total of 8,215 feet?
That hike is about a 10-day trek.
About 10 days. So when you think about having distance goals and elevation gain goals per week, you're going to want to focus on, I would say, more elevation gain than distance. And so the way that you accomplish that is with treadmill. On fitfortrips.com, there's a calculator where you can figure out like incline. You put in the incline and the distance you walk on the treadmill, it'll give you your elevation gain. So let's say, and again, I'm just kind of riffing now. Let's say your goal was 4,000 feet of elevation gain per week. So you could use the treadmill and you can use like a stair stepper machine. For every floor, let's say you do 50 floors, you multiply it times 10 feet. So you've got 500 feet that you've achieved. You can do 100 floors, that's 1,000 feet. And then on my website, I've also got a stair climbing calculator, meaning you can go to the stairs, measure the step height, and you put in how many steps there are and how many laps you do. It'll tell you your elevation gain. And then, of course, hiking and walking. And the reason why I came up with the Big Five is not everybody has the ability to hike and walk. But if you do, then you want to get some of that, and you can record that with All Trails or your Garmin watch or whatever you use. And the whole idea is at the end of each week, you want to tally up, again, let's say 4,000 feet of elevation gain. Again, it's a little arbitrary. But there's also a distinction between what I call virtual elevation gain and, let's say, true elevation gain. So the only way to get true elevation gain is stairs and hiking and walking or hill repeats or hiking with hills. Whereas I call the virtual elevation gain, so that's the Stairmaster and that's the treadmill. But, it's good to diversify your training. If you get 100% on like stairs, you're just going to crush your knees. So the difference between stairs and walking on an incline is on the incline, like treadmill, you're going to lengthen your Achilles and calf, and you don't really get that on the stairs. So distance, you're going to want to train a lot more distance for your weekly distance goals might be a lot longer. For Everest Base Camp, not as much. For Kili, and then probably the least for 14ers. Anyway, Will, did I miss anything? Do you want to share any of your training tips, or if what I said didn't make any sense and you want to clarify something, just jump in, man.
No, I think all that sounds spot on, Marcus. And, we've had this conversation before. For people who have access to trails, use them. The other thing that I always want people to train with are, if they can, are their hiking poles, as I definitely recommend trekking poles for these outings, these adventures. You've had personal experience about how they help. So train with them if you can. And then, incorporating as well, it's not as critical on Everest Base Camp and Kili, but the 14ers actually, it's, to make sure you train your nutrition, because, the 14er is actually, of all that we've talked about, it could potentially be the longest day out of any of these trips. I mean, the other two trips are longer from a time standpoint, but, on climbing a 14er, you're up at sunrise. You could be, not off the mountain until 3, 4 in the afternoon. So it could be a long day, and making sure you train your nutrition is going to be critical for that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the last thing we could talk about is equipment. So kind of distinguished, we don't need to get too much into technical climbing, but clearly it's a lot less expensive to do these trips that you're talking about, or that we've been talking about today. So I don't know, just riff on that, man.
Basically, on all of these trips, you're day hiking with a day pack. So you've got your footwear, make sure you got something that you've trained in and works. For all the trips, you can be in low cut or, regular hiking shoes for most all the trip. Summit day on Kili, you're going to want to have some heavier insulated boots. You can want that sometimes in Colorado as well. And it's really how hot or cold do you run? You're going to want to basically have the gear that's going to keep you warm. And the higher the altitude you get, generally the colder the temperatures are, the more insulation you're going to want. But it's not, the other nice thing is you're sleeping in a tent every night, or in a tea house on base camp, or in a Airbnb on a 14er. You don't have, a whole lot of crazy gear to get. On the Kili trip, we provide the tents, and everybody gets a gear list, right? A comprehensive gear list. But to your point, Marcus, it's not as expensive if you live in the United States and you live in a place where it gets to be winter and you have to wear warm clothes. That's basically what you're going to take on this trip. I think we recommend a 0-degree rated sleeping bag on Kili and on Everest Base Camp. So that's kind of how you want your sleeping bag rated, maybe -10. And for people who don't want to spend that or whatever, you can rent them. So yeah, relatively speaking, it's not crazy. It's not like the technical stuff where you're getting spikes and axes and ropes and harnesses and helmets and all that.
Okay. Man, that was fun.
Yeah.
All right. What's more fun is getting on the mountain. And actually that the journey of training prior, that ties it all together, man. So listen to the podcast, contact Will. So how do they get a hold of you, Will?
Yeah, so www.badass-adventures.com. That's my website.
Did you really have to say the www?
Yeah. You can edit that script. No.
All right, keep going.
Yeah, and then we've got, my phone number, 928-274-2424. Shoot me a text. My email's on the website. We've got 2 Everest Base Camp trips this year, one toward the end of April, one toward the end of October. And then a bunch of departure dates for Africa. June, July, September. Africa, we've got Kili, we've got safaris, we've got Zanzibar. You can do the whole trip. It's like 18, 19 days. Or you can just do Kili in a one-day safari. So we got options on that. But yeah, big trip calendar this year. A lot of adventures. And then, Colorado is right there. The Rockies aren't going anywhere. Yeah, we've got one Chicago Basin trip on the schedule. And then, of course, as you've experienced, Marcus, we do custom trips for guys who want their own deal. So,
all right, man. So here's the journey. Folks, when this podcast is over, I want you to build your bucket list, throw some 14ers on there, Everest Base Camp Kili, contact Will. Let's you and I have a conversation about your training. Life's too short, guys. So, I train people who are in their 60s, in their 70s, how to do all of these things. So there is no age barrier. As long as you're generally healthy, this stuff's for you guys. So anyway, Will, you're a good buddy, man. I appreciate your friendship and your time, your knowledge, and your experience. And I think everybody who listened today will appreciate the same. So, my friend, we will be in touch, okay?
Thanks, Marcus. Appreciate you having me on.
Okay. Yeah, you take care. That concludes this episode of the Hike Strong podcast. I'm committed to keeping all of the episodes for free. All I ask is that you subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. And don't forget to share this podcast with your friends. My goal is to build a vast community of hikers with the confidence to crush any local or global trail. I hope you will join me in this endeavor. So until next time, train, hike, repeat, and as always, I'm here to support you every step of the way.